But now we're going to go to Syrian girl. Of course, we've been talking about the Syrian refugee crisis for the past 3-4 weeks, basically, since it emerged. We had reports months ago about these migrants in northern France trying to hijack lorries to get from Calais to the United Kingdom. The media suddenly turned that into a massive issue. The whole migrant crisis began. Germany rolled out the red carpet to 800,000 migrants before the end of the year. Millions and millions more going forward. They suddenly freaked out a few days ago and thought, well, maybe letting in millions of people without them even having to show their passports or go through any kind of security check might not be a good idea in terms of security, in terms of the fact that ISIS have openly declared that they will exploit this migrant crisis to infiltrate 4,000 jihadists into Europe. And this is the point. Many of the legitimate, genuine Syrian refugees who need shelter, who need safety, are being usurped. Their characters are being dismantled by this wave of migrants who have nothing whatsoever to do with the Syrian civil war, hijacking this, fleeing to the welfare havens of Sweden and Germany off the back of public sympathy for Syrian refugees. So we're going to go to Syrian girl now. Of course, she's been a regular guest on the Alex Jones show before. Syrian girl, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be back.
So you came out with a video last week, I believe. It's extremely popular, got over 300,000-400,000 views, pointing out what the media refuses to report about this migrant crisis, which is what I've done over the past couple of weeks, and had basically 8 million views combined on Facebook and YouTube, just the past 3 videos. People are thirsty for the truth because they're not seeing it on BBC, they're not seeing it on CNN, they're not seeing it on Fox News, who are just blithely reporting that these are Syrian families coming in, they need refuge, they need shelter, when the truth is very much the opposite of that. And in fact, the character of these refugees is being denigrated by the behavior of those who are hijacking the crisis. So talk about the fact that many of these migrants, 90% of them in some areas, are claiming to be Syrian, yet have no documentation whatsoever to prove it. Who's hijacking this crisis and why are they doing it?
Well, there's multiple people hijacking the crisis. I think the top level people would be the business owners and the corporate people who want to basically crash the wages of Europe by bringing in cheap workers from overseas. That would be the number one type of people hijacking it. The other type, of course, would be some people who are workers from Pakistan, from Africa, from Central Asia. These people are also losing their passports and then claiming that they lost their passports in the Syrian war. And also, of course, there are refugees from other countries that have recently tasted regime change or humanitarian intervention that have come in along with the wave, and they're not being reported about either. And the reason for that is they don't want to remind Europe's population or the world in general that it's not just Syrian refugees, that there's been multiple wars that have created multiple refugees. And the reason for that is this neo-colonialist globalist agenda. They'd rather just concentrate on the Syrian refugees, number one, in order to garner sympathy for their cheap worker project, and also to make an excuse to attack Syria. Now, it sounds like it boggles the mind to use the fact that there's refugees escaping war and turn around and say, oh, that means we have to bomb Syria. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're claiming that the refugee crisis, the entire refugee crisis, is being caused by the Syrian government and ISIS. And the only way to stop the refugees flowing in is to bomb Syria. The problem with that is that completely ignores how this whole thing began, in which the US government and NATO and Obama decided to fund terrorism in Syria and Libya and also start a war in Iraq. And that's how ISIS was born. And that's why we have so much chaos. 4 years ago, Syria was the country that was accepting refugees, not the country that was producing refugees. Syria was a well-off country. Everybody was, maybe it wasn't a rich country with a high GPA, but living was fine. Everybody had homes, everybody had livelihoods and jobs, and they liked their lives. And if you listen to the refugees themselves, they want nothing more than to be able to go home. But
this is the point that I've made. If you listen to the actual Syrian refugees, they don't want to live in Sweden. They don't want to live in Germany. They want to go back to Syria. They want ISIS out of the country because they had a generally high standard of living. It's the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis, the North Africans that are exploiting this to flee to the welfare havens of Sweden and Germany because they want to be showered with free cash. And now the media in Germany is, characterizing that as xenophobic. We've got an ex-Stasi official hired by Facebook and the German government to censor posts on Facebook that are, quote, xenophobic. And again, it goes back to the fact that they're using this to justify further military intervention in Syria, when military intervention in Syria is what caused the frigging problem in the first place. And the military intervention that they've done against ISIS over the past 12, 18 months has been a complete failure, right? There are more ISIS militants than ever before in Syria. The weapons drops that they, conveniently run across are all dropped by US, airplanes. The fighters are increasing in number on a monthly basis. So that policy has clearly failed. What they need to do, what the White House needs to do, is work with the Russians, work with the Assad government. If they all worked together, they could wipe out ISIS within a matter of months, and this whole refugee crisis would be over. People would return to Syria, they would return to a high quality of life, and Europe wouldn't be overwhelmed by this wave of, quote, refugees who aren't even refugees to begin with, right?
Well, here's the thing. We say that their policy is a failure, but that would actually mean we have to accept that their policy is actually to fight ISIS.
Well, based on what they say, it's a failure. But you're saying
what they say,
they have an interest in maintaining an ISIS presence in the region. Explain the motivation behind that geopolitically.
Well, there's multiple motivations. Number one, to continue instability in Syria. ISIS, the region in which it controls, sits smack dab in Syria's oil and gas rich area, where the factories are and where a pipeline would actually go through Syria and into Europe, going from Iran. So there's the oil interests. There's also divide and conquer interests. If you keep these countries weak and unstable, and you sever the connection between Syria, Iraq, and Iran, you can more easily control them and bend them to your will. Of course, there's also, Israel has an interest also in seeing its neighbor Syria get destroyed, because it occupies the Golan Heights, and it's even though the United Nations acknowledges that the region of the Golan Heights, which it occupies, is Syrian land, the Israelis are already starting oil contracts and pumping oil from that area. So there's all these multiple agendas happening. And of course, Turkey has an interest in seeing ISIS stay in power, because they want to slaughter all the Kurds. And the Saudi Arabian government and Qatar have an interest in seeing ISIS maintain power, because it pushes their Wahhabist extremist ideology that just doesn't fit in Syria. But
let's talk about that. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Okay, they've taken in, I think it's about maybe 7 refugees. They came out a couple of weeks ago and said, because there was this huge backlash in the media, and even in the mainstream media with the Washington Post, pointing out the fact that these wealthy Gulf Arab states located right next to Syria had taken in 0 refugees. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and others, taken in 0 refugees. So Saudi Arabia comes out and says, that's not true. We've taken in 500,000 Syrian refugees. And then 3 days later, it was, no, we've taken in 2.5 million Syrian refugees. But as you have made the point, those Syrians living in Saudi Arabia were there before the civil war, before the refugee crisis. Saudi Arabia is brazenly lying about the fact that they've taken in 2.5 million refugees because they were already there on work visas. Talk about that.
Yeah, basically, there's a large number of Syrian engineers and scientists that have been working in Saudi Arabia for decades, and they're trying to say, look, that's us taking in Syrian refugees. You know, the way that the Gulf Arab states, one Kuwaiti politician put it, is that he'd rather, well, the reasons they're not allowing Syrians in is because Syrians are culturally and ethnically different to Gulf Arabs, which may be true. However, the Gulf states do allow people from around the world and Asia and Europe and, you know, everywhere to come in as workers. So, you know, that's a moot point. Basically, it's about money. It's about not spending money. They'd rather spend money on funding these terrorists to destroy Syria.
But they will build 200 mosques in Germany to spread this Wahhabi extremist ideology. That's okay, right?
Well, that's a joke I heard recently, that the Syrians were saying to each other, "Oh, don't worry, you know, the Saudi Arabians they can't, you know, accept any refugees, but they'll build you a mosque in Germany when you get there." So it's a joke that's running among Syrians, which they're very angry with the situation that they're being pushed into. And you know, I would like to also talk about what you said earlier, which is very important. I feel if they worked with the Russians and the Syrian government, they could defeat ISIS quite quickly. And in fact, there's 7 million Syrian refugees inside Syria. So that's like, if you add them all up, there'll be about 10-11 million Syrian refugees. That's half the Syrian population. There's entire cities that have been wiped out. People have to start from zero. They have nothing. They've been living in tents for 3 years with no future prospects. And you know, they have no schools to send their children, no jobs. And instead of helping Syria rebuild to accept these 10 million people, instead of you know, stopping the sanctions that the US has on Syria, or that NATO has on Syria, they continue with the sanctions, and in fact they escalate things, because the Russian military has always been inside Syria, but now the Russians are expanding their presence inside Syria, while not coordinating with the United States and its allies, who are also riding the wave of the refugee crisis to enter into Syria more. So there's this escalation.
Talk about that. Let's get into that. Well, so about a month ago, the Obama administration came out and said, we will bomb Syrian government positions if they are being advanced on by the Syrian rebels, which of course, as we've exhaustively documented for 3+ years, have defected to al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliated group, have defected to ISIS. They've sworn allegiance to those groups. They've committed war crimes almost on a par with ISIS. We're talking about FSA rebels ordering children to behead prisoners. So they've committed war crimes, atrocities, almost on a par with ISIS, probably not to the same extent in terms of the number of them, but still the same kind of bloodthirsty ideology of beheading people, torturing people. So the Obama administration comes out and said, you know, if the Syrian rebels are advancing on the presidential palace in Damascus, we will bomb Syrian government positions to help the rebels. How is that not a declaration of war in the first place? It was not reported by the media in the West that it was a declaration of war, which it was. Then we have Russia. Lavrov, the foreign minister, came out on Sunday and said that the US knows the positions of ISIS militants, where they're concentrated in huge numbers, but refuses to bomb them. Now we have Russia sending tanks, sending more weapons to Syria. What's behind this escalation in Russian military involvement in Syria? What's going to be right around the corner in terms of how this crisis escalates in light of the refugee crisis?
Well, the United Nations was built after World War II to prevent another world war. And for the first time in many, many decades, a sovereign nation is being attacked. This is Syria being attacked by the US and its allies without a UN Security Council resolution that allows for that. And when that happens, that means there's a member state on the Security Council, a superpower that opposes this. And the reason this created is to prevent a world war. And the fact that Russia has not agreed to the US entering Syria, which has been traditionally in its sphere of influence, means that it's setting things up for possibly a clash. There are US Air Force jets and Russian troops in Russian bases on the coast of Syria. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation, and the Russians themselves have no interest in funding these al-Qaeda-linked groups. The ex-ambassador to Syria, the US ambassador Robert Ford, who used to really support the Syrian rebels, after being kicked out of the US government, he's come out and openly said, we couldn't pry them away from al-Qaeda. So it's quite blatantly clear that the NATO and allies have no interest in stopping the refugee flow. They don't care about kids drowning on the shores of Turkey or Greece. All they want is to continue the war and let ISIS be contained inside Syria and continue killing people. And the thing about the refugees, again, nobody wants to be displaced from their nation because it's humiliating. Being without a nationality means basically you're nothing. And a lot of the time, because of the way that the media is portraying things, and because of the feeling in Europe, you get videos of refugees being kicked on the street because of the war they're running from, and it's completely inhuman and dehumanizing. And the person who's doing it just makes anyone who is against what's happening look bad. Anyone that's against the creation of these refugees, anyone who agrees with kicking refugees, it makes them look bad. So they're basically stage managing both the right and the left to push for this to happen.
Well, I found it interesting how the mass media took that example of the Hungarian camera woman tripping up a refugee who was fleeing into the country illegally with his family. That was bad, that was horrible, I disagree with that. But the media took it and it was like a international news story for 3 days. What they don't play is refugees throwing rocks at Hungarians at a train station. They don't show refugees stealing from charitable Europeans who are handing out gifts. And I've put all this footage up on YouTube, it's got millions of views. They don't show Italian elderly women being torn out of their cars by their hair by migrants from North Africa who want to steal the car to get into Germany. So they're exploiting our sympathy to welcome this wave of migrants, half of whom aren't Syrian, the other half, 90%, can't prove they're Syrian. And then we had this story a couple of weeks ago, which was really the bellwether emotional manipulation that they needed to really get Western governments and populations to invite this wave of people in, which was the tragic case of the boy who was drowned on a Turkish beach. That was completely misreported. We only found out the truth about exactly what happened, the details of that incident days later. Tell us about what actually happened in the lead up to how that boy ended up being drowned on a Turkish beach.
Well, honestly, I'm not sure about the specific details. I did hear various reports that the boy's father, he was they're actually from the city of Kobani, and that was a city that has been shelled by the US because ISIS is present there, but they're Kurds, they're against ISIS, and they've been living in Turkey.
They were already in Turkey.
Yes, they were living for 3 years.
Syria. They were fleeing Turkey. No. To try and get to European welfare states, right? So they were already safe in Turkey. Case. That wasn't communicated in the original story. Then it turns out that the driver of the boat that ended up with this boy being drowned was the father himself. They were quite a wealthy family. He was trying to get his teeth done in Canada or whatever. So it was completely misreported. Yes. It was oh, these people are fleeing from Syria, these poor refugees, and the little boy ends up dead, which is tragic. But they don't tell the whole side of the story.
There's been many drownings. He wasn't the only boy. I mean, if you want to talk about kids drowning, it's been happening since a month before. So whether like they take this specific case that he was trying to get his teeth fixed, the fact is that living in a tent for 3 years in Turkey, whether it turns out he is the smuggler or not, he denies that he was the smuggler. There was a report about that. But in any case, whatever the details.
No, he was driving the boat and he had paid people smugglers.
Oh, he claims that's a lie, but I don't know.
Claims now, okay.
Well, but it doesn't. The specifics.
I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't tragic. It was, but it was misreported from the very beginning, right? So why are they doing that? Why does the media suddenly care about Syrian children when they were pushing to bomb Syrian children for 2-3 years? In 2012, 2013. Why do they suddenly care about this little boy when they wanted to bomb Syria? They were pushing the agenda
on the day that he died, another little girl was bombed in Syria by the Syrian rebels that they were supporting. But that's not something that they report on. So no matter what the specifics of this child and the surrounding case, there have been multiple children that have been drowning over the last few months. 2 months ago, there was an 11-year-old girl that died off the coast of Egypt. The reporting, the media and their reporting is constantly biased, and there's an agenda behind it, and it's never a humanitarian agenda. No matter the specifics of this case and the guy wanting to fix his teeth, whether he was convinced that by the people around him that it would be a good idea, or if his situation was very bad, living in a tent, or his teeth were infected. It's a sad case, but it's not the only case. The global idea of it is there are 10 million people, and you cannot airlift all of them to Europe from Syria. And the only solution is to allow them to return home by ending the war, ending the funding of terrorism, fixing the buildings, and letting them go home, because that's the best solution for everybody that's concerned. The thing is that the people who are coming out of the countries, many of them are scientists and engineers, and there's this big brain drain happening. And even if you don't take serious case, but the refugee crisis as a whole, you've got the sub-Saharan Africans countries still paying a tax to France, which and suppressing their economy from ever building up to keep their workers, young male workers, at home. This is all being created, and no matter the circumstances, I did hear the report of the woman accusing the man of being the smuggler, but I just, there's
you have to go again. The main point is you go to the source, right? Don't destabilize secular governments in the Middle East. Don't arm and fund jihadists that overthrow those secular governments, as we saw in Libya, which was the most prosperous country in Africa before the overthrow of Gaddafi, right? As soon as they got rid of Gaddafi, who, like Saddam Hussein, was a tyrant in his own way, and we don't support him, they were putting black people in concentration camps. Tribal warlords were running the country. And it completely collapsed. And that's what started this migrant crisis, with a wave of people coming over in boats, because they're trying to escape the hell that these NATO powers created in the first place. But that still is never mentioned in mainstream media coverage. They don't even allude to it in many cases. So I've said it a million times. It sounds like a cliche now, but I still say it because they refuse to talk about it. And this is the truth that people want to hear, which is why your video was super successful, which is why the videos I've put out have gone viral. We're talking to Syrian girl now about the migrant crisis, which has been portrayed by the media as the Syrian refugee crisis. They've left out a lot of factors that we've drawn attention to over the past couple of weeks. One of which is the fact that while at least half of these migrants, and maybe more, are not even from Syria, and they're fleeing into Europe to a higher standard of living. They're not fleeing from ISIS. They're not fleeing from war. The actual legitimate, genuine Syrian refugees themselves, who have complained about the fact that Bangladeshis and Pakistanis are faking IDs to claim to be Syrian to get into these European countries, there's a whole different side to it, which is the fact that they want to go home. They don't want to live in these welfare havens. They want to go back to Syria as it was before the civil war that was created by the US, by the NATO powers, arming and funding jihadists in Syria because they had a relatively high standard of living. We're going to go to a clip now, which is Syrian refugees talking about how they want to go back home. This is a powerful clip. Let's go to the video.
ما كانت لأنه أنا أول الناس اللي راح أرجع لها لأنه بعد سوريا ما في مهما طلعت وفتلت بعدها ما في.
My name is Rena. I wish to come back to the lovely country when the war will end.
I like the war to be end. Just I can go to see my friends and my family in Syria.
أمر خارجي بتمويل خارجي بس نحن عايشين وراح نرجع.
That was a clip of Syrian refugees talking about how they don't want to go to Europe. Now, the way this has been framed in the mainstream media is that many of these refugees are crossing for humanitarian purposes. What they've hidden is the fact that many of them aren't. And in fact, now we've got cases in Italy and other areas where they're literally attacking citizens. They're throwing rocks at Hungarians. Now, from my perspective, from the video footage that I've seen, it's generally the Syrian refugees, and they interviewed some of them in Greece, who are the most civilized, the most well-behaved. They've got genuine reasons for wanting refugee status in the first place. They're complaining about the fact that their character, their reputation is being denigrated by many of these economic migrants who aren't refugees, who aren't fleeing from ISIS. They're not fleeing from war. They're fleeing to a higher standard of living in the welfare havens of Germany and Sweden, which will be paid for by European taxpayers. So, Syrian girl, talk about the distinction between actual Syrian refugees who temporarily want safety but eventually want to go home, and these migrants from Bangladesh, Pakistan, other areas who are just fleeing to a higher standard of living.
Well, with these immigrant workers, or these people pretending to be Syrian in order to go and work in Europe from Bangladesh and Pakistan, they have probably homes back in Pakistan, back in Bangladesh. They had maybe jobs, maybe they weren't high-paying jobs, but they could probably eat and function. But if you take a Syrian refugee, everything they owned has been destroyed. They have no jobs, they have no homes, they have nothing, and they're starting from scratch. So they've been living in tents under the snow in Turkey and the heat in Jordan for 3 years, coming from apartment buildings and living normal lives. Basically, it's not the same. This is a war situation, and of course, some people are saying, well, why don't they just stay in Turkey? Yeah. Most of them are just staying in Turkey. There's 1 million refugees inside Turkey, but the problem is the numbers are so high and the conditions are so bad, they end up begging on the street. And for people who are engineers or just regular workers, that they had shops, from going to that to begging on the street and sleeping on the street with your children, that's the reason people are risking their lives to cross over. But of course, the real solution is to stop the crisis, is to stop the wars, but the opposite is happening. They are continuing their bombing, and it's not defeating ISIS. In fact, it's strengthening ISIS because they refuse to work with the only force on the ground that is actually an army that is fighting ISIS, which is the Syrian army. Why? Still because of their regime change objectives. That's it.
And going back to this factor of Saudi Arabia, so a lot of these refugees, up to 2 million, I think it is, as you mentioned, they've been living in these tents in Turkey and other areas, which during the winter are, harsh conditions. This is a terrible standard of living. Meanwhile, in Saudi Arabia, they have 100,000 tents. And when I say tents, these are like high quality temporary facilities. They've got air conditioning. They've got kitchen facilities. They've got bathroom facilities. These tents are air conditioned. In the town of Mina, Saudi Arabia, 100,000 of these tents that can house up to 30 people each. So you're talking about potentially 3 million people being able to settle there as refugees. They use them for 5 days of the year. And the Saudi government spent tens of millions of dollars on these tents. They're permanent constructions, they're not temporary. They use them for 5 days of the year for Hajj, for this Muslim pilgrimage. But they're saying, no, we won't take in any Syrian refugees, even though they've got the facilities to do so. And I've been getting messages from Saudi Arabians for the past 2 weeks since I put out this article saying, oh yeah, but they're there for Hajj. We can't. Well, go and have Hajj somewhere else. Surely they have other facilities elsewhere to have that, annual pilgrimage. Why aren't Saudi Arabia handing over these 100,000 tents to be used by Syrian refugees when they're perfectly set up for that very purpose?
Well, Hajj, it isn't held in Mecca, so it has to happen in Saudi Arabia. But, the reason why they don't use those tents every other, day of the year, or if they don't make people go to Hajj, stay in hotels instead of those tents, is because their religion, their interpretation of Islam is one which is completely hypocritical and doesn't actually serve poor people, which was supposed to be, the real reason. During Ramadan, you're supposed to give money to the poor. Instead, they're really only looking
that's the concept of the Islamic Ummah, right? You help Muslim brothers throughout the Muslim world, right?
Supposedly, but really they don't want to put refugees in the tents. They'd rather get money from tourists, which are pilgrims coming for Hajj. So they're complete fakers. They're what can I say? The epitome of hypocrisy. And another thing when you look at the Middle East and which countries are accepting refugees and which ones aren't, Israel is one of the other countries which nobody has ever questioned why they haven't accepted any refugees. And of course, when Israel began, there was a huge exodus of Palestinian refugees. There's still like 3 million of them remain to be refugees for the last 60 years around the world, including in Syria. And there seems to be this agenda to push people out of some place and put them someplace else, to basically displace people. And perhaps the idea of that is to dissolve national identity itself.
We've played the videos. You mentioned the one earlier about the Kuwaiti analyst. And we had another one from an Israeli politician who said, we're not going to allow millions of refugees into the country who don't share the same culture in many instances, who don't share the same religion, because it would completely undermine and dissolve, for example, the Jewish state of Israel. And I agree with them. That's generally true. But then why is it racist and xenophobic to say the same thing about Europe? Why has Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, been denounced in the media for saying that just allowing millions of Muslim migrants into Europe, which is founded on Christian principles, may not be so great for social cohesion? Why is it racist to say that in terms of Europe, but for Kuwait and Israel, it's perfectly legitimate to say that?
Yeah, it seems to be Europe is the real target for this, this nationality being dissolved. The EU is part of that. But with this guy, this Israeli politician, you would agree with him if the nation of Israel itself wasn't created off of mass illegal immigration of Europeans who put themselves in the Middle East. And it's the Syrians and the Palestinians who originally lived in that land, whether it be Syrian, whether it be Muslims or Jews. There's still, a big percentage of like 50% of the region being Muslim and 50% being Jewish, if you counted Palestine and Israel as one entity. And of course, there's Jewish people living inside Palestinian territories, and there's Muslim people living inside Israeli territory. So the interesting thing, about what this man is saying is that Israel itself was started off from illegal mass immigration. And, when it comes to Syria, this whole crisis started because people from the Gulf and from Europe even, and the Libya and Algeria were coming in to join ISIS and illegally crossing into Syria. So, it's complete chaos. And it seems to be that borders don't mean anything anymore.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left. First of all, we've got a video coming up, which is video game social engineering. We've talked about Gamergate before, certainly on my YouTube channel, maybe not generally for the Alex Jones Show audience. So try to explain in 1 minute what Gamergate is. And this has been a difficult task for most people because many are still completely ignorant as to what Gamergate is as a movement, as a phenomenon. And then we'll get into this video. So 1 minute, what's Gamergate? What's it all about?
Well, it's been happening for a year, but basically there's an agenda to use video games to socially engineer and brainwash children. And the people who have this agenda got sort of a slight bit of a backlash from people who enjoy video games just for the sake of playing the games. And as a result of this, this resistance that the gamers were putting up to the brainwashing agenda, the media began to attack the gamers themselves. And from that media attack, the gamers decided that, oh, the media must be corrupt. And they began to expose not only the media, but the people behind the agenda to brainwash people, to brainwash the next generation, basically employing video games.
So this is about the fact that video games are the biggest entertainment industry on the planet, bigger than movies. They're having problem embedding their social engineering in, sitcoms or news or whatever because they're getting less and less views. So they basically got together and decided they need to insert this politically correct social engineering into video games. We've got a clip coming up which is 30 seconds long. Just introduce this clip. 20 seconds, go.
Well, SEAL Team 6 is a crew that investigates and digs up evidence of the fact that there are many agendas trying to use video games to brainwash. And they produced this documentary, and this is the introduction to a series of documentaries that they're going to be releasing in the coming days.
Okay, let's go to the clip. Here it is.
We have an opportunity to create a new form of games.
We need to design games that are good for learning.
We can change people's perspective on race or on gender through play.
Motivation and changing behavior.
So through the Difference Engine initiative, we seek to plant the seeds of change.
Yeah, I have an agenda, sorry.
But it works, and I don't know how it works.
So they have an agenda to change people's behavior through video games. Explain why that's so insidious.
It's really insidious because they're pumping millions and millions of dollars into trying to promote their own version of what society should look like, and the government is involved in this. The United States government is involved in this, as is the Bill Gates Foundation. Many agendas going into this, and they've been using television and other forms of media to do this in the past. To promote their wars and to promote other social reconstruction agendas, as you've talked about many times on the Alex Jones Show. And this is just another facet of the prison planet, which you've been discussing.
And we're going to have you back on to talk about that in the future because we've run out of time. Quick 30-second plug for your YouTube channel and how people can find you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Please join me on my YouTube channel, Syrian Girl Partisan. Google Syrian Girl Partisan or Partisan Girl, and my YouTube channel should come up.
Okay, Syrian Girl, thanks for joining us. I will be back in 2 hours with Rob Dew to cover the news on the next segment of the Money Bomb.
Did you know that only 6 corporations control 90% of what millions of Americans see, hear, and read every single day? It's the illusion of choice. Think about it. The mainstream media is owned by only a handful of megacorporations with vested interests. But on the other hand, the internet is an interconnected network of billions of sources. So you can research information for yourself from multiple sources, or you can blindly accept what you hear or read in the mainstream media, never questioning what you are being told. This gives you a false sense of reality. I mean, do you actually know what you think you know? Or have you been programmed to accept someone else's version of events? Think about it. This is Darren McBreen, and I want you to break the matrix at Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.tv and listen to The Alex Jones Show, because there's a war on your mind.
I began to get into iodine a few years ago because it was helping me and my family so much get healthy and detoxify. I believe our research is conclusive. This is the best iodine out there. And I know this for a fact. Nobody else has got iodine based on these pure crystals, ladies and gentlemen.
For a limited time, experience the ancient power of Survival Shield X2. Take advantage of this unprecedented 30% off Super Detox Special at InfoWarsLife.com.